the toilet blocks up, which is not a rare occurrence. And we had it described to us how prisoners are forced to try and clear the blockage. There are some particular prisoners with particular problems. For example, Secondi is in a dip, and so there's a problem of flooding in that prison with the associated risks of malaria. So the two issues of sanitation and health are concerns. The capacity of the prison to respond to the health needs is limited. There are nurses who I think are able to do some fine work, but they're under pressure because of the number of prisoners. And so this is the shape of the health sanitation problem. We have major concerns there.
Major concerns there. Did you, and staying with you, I'll go back to ASP for a whole response to that. But beyond that, and those are largely environmental issues, environmental rights, etc., that you've mentioned and all. Did you conduct any research on rights with respect to freedoms, etc., because they still have some form of freedom within the prison that you cannot, for example, say unless and until you are in a condemned cell, and I stand to be corrected, those in the general areas, if they have rights to food, and even if you're a condemned cell, you have a right to food. So if you have your food and it's deprived or you're denied it, or you have some rights to say some reading time or some books, some rights to say even exercise and all that, those are all human rights issues. Did you find that they were at liberty to engage in these activities?
Well, that's a question where you have the reality and the theory. I mean, the prisoners, yes, they have right to food, and they eat food. They get 3 meals a day. But we had described to us the sense of the prisoners that it was inadequate. And when we talked to staff, they said exactly the same thing. They felt that the food was inadequate. And in fact, the budget for food was very low up until the end of last year. And that's one of the positive changes that's happened in the period since we've been, since we were here, that the budget for food has been tripled. So the prisoners have the right to food. When we were here, the food was inadequate, but they could eat. Do they have the right to exercise? They're allowed out of the prison cells. They can move around the yard. It's very limited to describe it as exercise. I mean, they walk around and they can talk. They're at liberty in that restricted sense. They do have access, or there are programs of training and education which are there, but they have their own limitations. Some of the equipment is a bit outdated. The take-up by the prisoners is also limited. So, and we may come back to this because it's rather a key point that if you want to reform prisoners, you've got to give them a way to survive when they leave the prison. But our feeling, having visited the prisons that we did, was that the existence of these programs is welcome, but they needed to be strengthened, improved, and reformed.
Okay, great. ASP, so tell me, I mean, human rights is a major issue. Is it really something that features on the agenda of the prisons, so to speak, in the way it is run and all of that? I visited the prisons as a final year student of law school. Samoku Jeto always carries his class there. And so we did, but that was 6 years ago. I haven't been back, and I was in Sawam and saw things for myself. I'm sure it's a long time. I cannot use that as a basis to judge. And it was only the men's wing that we went to as well. But a lot of them, as we went there, hearing that we were law students, etc., really thought that they could tell us stories. And they did tell us stories. There were some that told us about how access to a lawyer, etc., was difficult. And actually, you see in the report, when I was perusing it, that the introduction actually begins with a quotation from Nana, a pregnant woman in her 20s with an 11-month-old baby at home who was serving a 4-year sentence for petty theft. And I quote her, "I had a lawyer that my family paid for, but I don't have money to make an appeal. Another woman was pregnant and appealed and got out. I just don't want to be here. I want to go home. My child is my problem. I want to go home." End of quote. And we heard many similar stories. People telling us about how certain sometimes were denied certain things. Someone was complaining that sometimes you are pushed back in there. It's time for you to go out and you dare not talk because you're at the behest of the officer. His mood determines what you get to enjoy, whether you go out or you stay in and all that. I mean, are those really critical issues? Is it just they know that it's 6 o'clock, I'm going out as a matter of right for sure, or that you really have to just wait for a good day? The officer must be smiling.
You mean going out, as in going out of your cell?
No, out of your cell, having the general things that within the four corners of the prison, there are certain things that you've already been told. When you come in, they told us that you can do this, you can do that, you can run here, you can sit here at this time, you can even listen to the radio. Some of them listen to programs and all that. Are those things assured, or it just depends on somebody's mood?
Not at all. Those things are there as a matter of policy and right. And so if it is time for them to come out, they will come out. Except, of course, somebody who probably for a disciplinary action has to be given a certain kind of sanction. For instance, there's something we call lockup, where at the time you're supposed to be probably opened, you're supposed to be under a kind of lockup for flouting or breaching a particular regulation.
What kind of regulations do they breach, for example?
We have our regulations that we use to ensure discipline. And so if you do any action that is contrary to good order and discipline, there are various sanctions that apply. That is exactly what I'm referring to. So
you are saying that really, as far as you're concerned, they are not suppressed?
At all. At all.
At all?
At all.
At all is your answer. Talking prisons tonight, and of course, particular reference to the Amnesty International report. And let's come back and deal with the issue of women, the women prison. And I'll be happy to know what again you found in your report with regard to women, because there are so many stories. I don't want to take the wind out of your sail regarding the answer you will give. But people out there generally have this issue about pregnancies. They say sometimes you go in there before you get pregnant. With who? How does it happen? The women are not together with the men in those places. So who does it? Or do they go in there with their pregnancy already in their pockets, so to speak, and all that? What did you find?
Well, just to get the statistics in sense that the percentage of women prisoners is quite small compared to men. And that's the same more or less globally, that women are a small fraction of the prison body.
Right.
And of that small fraction that's women, a smaller fraction are pregnant or have babies. We interviewed some women. We interviewed all the women on death row. There are 4 women in the condemned block. And we interviewed some women with young infants. They had obvious concerns arising from the situation they were in with their baby. They had to provide for it, and the system doesn't adequately provide, as a matter of right or entitlement, the materials they need. So the women are in, obviously the law is followed and they're in separate institutions. They're not mixed with the men.
Sure.
The staff are women, and the women that we met who were pregnant they came into the prison pregnant. So the difficulties they face, compared to the men where the prisons are overcrowded, the women's prisons tend not to be, and the women have a sense of isolation, particularly the women on death row who are, by policy, separated and sleep alone in their cell. So it's a mix of problems in accessing the materials they need. They do receive materials from the prison officers as a bit out of compassion. But they really need to have guarantees of the additional food they need and other supplies. We did see some examples of verbal harassment of women prisoners by guards, and I can't make any extrapolation from that, but at least we know that it does happen. The women have they're in a tough situation. For one additional reason, that they don't get the visits that the men do. Men tend to get visits from family, and for the women it's much less so.
ASP Acheb, On page 27 of the report, reference is made to, discussion is done of ill treatment. And it says that ill treatment is not frequent. And here we're dealing with the women. It's not frequent. However, there were complaints of beatings. And according to the report, one officer actually confirmed that sometimes there's what they call that the inmates are lightly caned. Lightly caned. I don't know what that means. But really, can you throw some light on that? Does that actually happen? Caning lightly?
Thank you very much. Let me say that our rules of engagement do not allow corporal punishment being meted to any inmate. Let me say emphatically that we are made to understand that imprisonment is as a punishment and not for punishment. And so when
say that again.
Imprisonment is as a punishment and not for punishment.
It's as a punishment. You are imprisoned as a punishment.
Yes.
But you're not imprisoned for purpose of punishing you.
Yeah.
Okay.
And so the fact that you've been in prison alone is enough punishment. So when you come into our custody, our duty is to work on your reformation. So it goes against our rules and regulations for any prison officer to actually mete out any form of ill treatment to any prisoner. And if that kind of complaint reaches the officer in charge, it is investigated. If you are found culpable, you are sanctioned.
Have there been any such sanctions to any officers?
No, any that I can readily recall of late. Yeah.
It says that Nana, I'm still on page 27, a female inmate in her 20s, said that she had not suffered physical abuse, but that verbal abuse was frequent. Quote her, the officers insult you, they humiliate you, they make fun of you and why you are here, unquote. Now it says Amnesty International itself witnessed one incident of a prison guard aggressively yelling at an inmate. Another woman, Rebecca, also in her 20s, said, quote, sometimes I feel lonely, I feel very upset. It feels as though my family has given up on me. The situation here is very difficult. You get insults from officers and inmates, and when no one comes to visit you, they humiliate you, they spit in your food. That's a serious thing to say. That's at the heart of human rights. Who would do the spitting? That's strange.
That is not quite clear. I'm not too sure what there are things that's attributed to both officers and inmates.
But here she says you get insults from officers and inmates, yes.
Okay.
And when one comes to visit, and when no one comes to visit you, they humiliate you. They spit in your food. So you are saying that they here is distributive. It could be both the inmates and the officers. I can't tell whether it's
inmates or officers. Probably James will be in a position to tell us, depending
because
on
it's their report.
Interaction they had, yes.
Yes. James, do you recollect this particular incident, and do you know who it is that this lady is referring to doing things as spitting in their food?
Well, that was an account given to us,
right.
But we obviously didn't see the spitting but we did see that act of verbal abuse that's described there.
But who was she complaining about in terms of the spitting? Fellow inmates or the officers?
An officer.
An officer.
I want to both acknowledge that what my co-panelist is saying about the laws and the regulations. And our problem is not so much with the laws and regulations, but when they're broken or the challenges faced by prisoners who might want to complain, but the act of complaining is quite difficult, which is one of the reasons why we are very strongly in favour of transparency and monitoring. And it's important that prisoners have an independent voice so that if they do have concerns, they can express them. I think the openness shown by the prison service, for example, in allowing us in, is commendable. But we would like to see it a little wider, expanded and systematised so that this light can be shone on these dark places.
Yes, but they mentioned bribery in the prison. Is this something you are aware of? Again, I could read from the report to give it more life. Some inmates also reported incidents of petty bribing within the prison. Juliet told Amnesty International, quote, if you don't have money, they don't treat you well. Sometimes they take bribes, unquote. Other inmates also noted either that favors were done for money or that money was demanded by prison officers in return for doing a favor. Is that a fair comment on what happens there?
I would not intend to dispute that, but I will say that if that should happen at all, it goes against our rules of engagement. And then I would also want to believe that if it has happened, it should be an isolated case. As we say in Ghana, in every home there's a mensa. All officers are aware that there are certain things they're not supposed to do, but one person may, at one time or the other, go against the law. As I said, if it is established, sanctions apply, and there are times that people even get dismissed for some misconducts.
If all these things are being reported, for example, Carol, a female inmate, says, and I quote her, "You know what hurts the most? We don't have phone contact with our families, but this is the worst part. To receive a phone call is supposed to be free, but they ask for a bribe." I mean, I'm dwelling on the human rights bit and all that and what happens, and because, I mean, these are some of the issues where the fact that they are there doesn't mean they are condemned to all of this. And if these things are happening, for example, and you say no sanction, or again, you're saying these are isolated cases.
They should be isolated cases.
You don't think this is the norm?
No, it shouldn't be the norm.
So do people have the right to make free phone calls or receive them? Is that the norm?
Yes, but not with mobile phones. Now, if you need to receive a mobile phone call, then there is a need for an officer to monitor the kind of conversation you would have.
Okay.
We tried introducing a line kind of mobile, kind of telephone conversation in some male prison. But unfortunately, the inmates began abusing the system, and then it had to be put on hold for a while. So yes, they allowed visits. People come to visit them, and if you receive a telephone call, probably from a family member through an officer, you are allowed to receive such a call, but they themselves are not supposed to keep mobile phones on themselves.
So let me ask you, James, as we speak about all this, and we have a few minutes to go, 5 minutes or so, to bring this segment to a close. I don't know what your comments are on this particular bits that we spoke about. What happens, the treatment, the bribe, collection of bribe, and all of those things. Did you find that to be a pervading situation, or do you agree with the ASP that these are just isolated cases?
Well, it's very hard to make a definitive estimation. We didn't do a particular scientific survey. We listened to the prisoners we interviewed, and all I can say is that it was something that came up in reports, and it was something that meant when we wrote it into the report, we put it there because we think it's a significant thing. And we know that bribery is a feature in many societies, and also particularly within prisons, because that's the way prisoners can get favours that they can't get through other channels. So we would tend to believe those reflected a problem. I wouldn't say that it was isolated, but I couldn't tell you the scale of it.
You couldn't tell me the scale of it. Staying with you, what do you make of training, education, and recreation? It's in your report. What did you find? What are your conclusions on that?
We start off from two ends. One is that the prisoners have a right to education, to training, and mechanisms for self-advancement within the prison. And at the other end, we can see prisoners leaving prison, returning to their homes, and needing to work, needing to sustain themselves, needing to support their families. And so what happens at one end has a lot of relevance to what happens at the other. So for us, these training facilities and programs are very important. They were there, as I said earlier, they were there, but they were limited in scope, and they were limited in affiliation by the prisoners. We think it would be good to see more prisoners doing better quality courses.
ASP, what do you have to say about that? What is happening with recreation and all of that, and reintegration to society when people's times are up and all? What's happening? Yeah,
thank you very much. I think I agree to a large extent with James on that score. We are doing a number of training programs for our inmates, but like I said, it's limited. As we speak now, the formal education program that we started since 2009, we every year channel the number of inmates who sit for the BEC and the WASI, but it's quite limited, as he said. As we speak now, we don't even have a definite classroom block that we're using for this kind of education. It's just some structures in the prisons that we convert into, sheds and that kind of thing. So yes, the facilities are not there for us to do more. And I think that if we get proper facilities, we should be able to do more and better.
Our time is up. We have to go. I think I can take 2 messages or so before we have to go. Leslie Attorney, seriously, government needs to pay more attention to our prisons, especially the food and the way they sleep. All right, thank you, Leslie, for that message. Afum PM, Akwesi says they deserve it. They must suffer. He's talking about the inmates. That's his view about them. I'm sure there are a few more messages. As I have a few minutes to round up, difficulty rolling those messages over, but we have to go. I hope that, is there a situation with HIV/AIDS? If you can do this in 30 minutes, communicable diseases and particular reference to HIV/AIDS.
Yes, we have cases of HIV. Some of our inmates living with HIV, and we have a unit also known as HIV/AIDS control program, and they do a number of programs, sensitization and linking them to treatment. And so we have that.
We have to really go, be true to our word. James Wells, Research Officer, Amnesty International London, thank you for coming. Courage Achem, Chief Public Relations Officer, Ghana Prisons, thank you for coming. Moving on to the second segment of our show tonight, and we are talking Charles Taylor, Dr. Ken Ahosu, Research Fellow, Center for International Affairs, it's actually Legon Center for International Affairs and Diplomacy, LESIAD, is on the line. Good evening to you, Doc.
Good evening.
Thank you very much for joining us.
You're welcome.
All right. Charles Taylor, we're told, has been found guilty. Sorry, Doc. Are you able to lower the set with which you are monitoring us?
No, I'm not monitoring.
Oh, you are? You're not? I see. Okay, all right. I'm getting feedback. I'm sure we'll work on it technically. But basically, Charles Taylor is in the news. We all know that. What do you make of the verdict as it was delivered today?
Yeah, as I said, I've been saying since yesterday that he'll be given the guilty verdict. The guilty verdict has been given. To those who suffered directly under him, he as side of Bribery and lovers of human rights are happy that eventually impunity is punished in Africa, one of Africa's worst offenses. But there are a lot of questions for the position of African leaders in the world, procedural issues, the political nature of the trial, and then the cost of the trial, as well as the situations on the ground in Liberia and Sierra Leone, whereby situations are getting worse even before the war began. So the grievances that led to the war or the antecedents to the war are still present. So the question is that, is the international community just interested in justice? Is it interested in reconciliation? Is it truly interested in the plight of poor people?
Charles Taylor must be the first head of state who has actually been convicted by an international court since the Nuremberg trials after World War II. Is that fact of any significance?
Yeah, in terms of crimes against humanity, in times crimes against human rights, he's the first person. But in a political trial of such crimes, Noriega of Panama is an example who has been tried for money laundering, also human rights abuse, and trade in narcotic drugs. So it's a similar issue, but in terms of crimes against humanity, the Taylor is the first.
What is its significance?
Well, for me, the significance, you cannot, as we say, you cannot step in the same water twice. No two issues are the same. Every issue has to be contextualized. Well, the idea is that this will send warning to warlords. But then, you will realize that anytime detectives are aware or have been charged with crimes against humanity, it is then that crimes against humanity become worse. Talking of Sudan in 2003, talking even of Chastela in 2003, that was the time that the worst crimes have been committed. So the timing is one factor, whether it will lead to a change of heart of leaders not to abuse rights, or rather it will spur them on as to abuse more rights, as to what, eke out some form of concession, it is still yet to be known.
The panel, I believe, was from Ireland, Samoa, and Uganda. Some thought that at some point there were questions raised about it. Some also were looking at the Ugandan and African connection in there and all that. Were you surprised by the unanimity of the verdict?
No. From the very onset, as I said, I've been speaking to this issue over a week now that it was coming, and I told them that there will not be any other verdict than guilty verdict, because the purpose for which the court was set, and then the manner in which the arrest was done, despite the fact that Charles Taylor has committed these crimes or have committed atrocious crimes, the whole process has been in such a political, how will I call it, a political limelight, or has been politically colored that there was no other way, especially the revelation that American intelligence, WikiLeaks has revealed that American intelligence and British intelligence have made it clear that Stella, under all circumstances, should be kept behind bars in order to bring about stability in Liberia and Sierra Leone, makes it clear that there was going to be only one verdict, and the verdict is that he's guilty.
But according to the New York Times, the judges were of the view that the prosecution had actually failed to prove that Charles Taylor directly commanded the rebels responsible for the atrocities, and the atrocities yet form the basis of his conviction. Does that amount to a contradiction in terms?
Well, as I'm saying, yes, the process, I was talking earlier on of the process, that the process itself has been so political that it is not real. It's not been clearly substantiated that he has aided them in this manner. But if you read the judgment carefully, the judge that read the statement argued that in West Africa, conditions are such that things are not properly documented and that they could not put fingers on issues. But what they primarily based their judgment was the earlier interviews they had with the victims of war in Sierra Leone.
But can you use that? I mean, interviews with victims of war, and so many of them, Osman Toure has made quite a name because of that, because he also suffered some amputation, and he said that for him, Charles Taylor was responsible for all of that. But if there's a failure in proving that direct control by Charles Taylor, what then is the basis for that conviction if those 11 crimes are what was being tried for the 13 months that the deliberations went on for? What then was a direct thing? Was it just based on people saying we believe that he caused it?
The point is that Charles Taylor made some statement earlier on when ECOMOG intervened. He said he would extend the war to Sierra Leone. And there has been quite a close link. There is a guest house that has been located in Liberia, which was said to be the place that he was housing the RUF rebels and that sort of thing. But to sum it all, the evidence is mostly circumstantial. And most of the time in Western courts, whereby especially these are very serious crimes, he shouldn't have seen the limelight. But as I'm saying, I cannot speak for Charles Taylor that she's not guilty. But then in terms of evidence and in terms of proving it beyond reasonable doubt, I don't think that has been done. But then it is very clear that there is a perception. If you listen to the defense lawyer, he made an argument that when he first went to court as a solicitor, they asked him he should sit at the back because Aki sits at the back. There is a perception about African leaders as dictators, that they are bloodthirsty, they are that sort of thing. The same thing applies to male Africans who are seen as wife beaters and that sort of thing. So most of the time in situations like these, judgments are colored. It is not clear-cut as the Western situation applies to. So that's the issue. But the more serious issue as I am thinking of is that to incarcerate Charles Taylor in the UK is going to cost 39,000 a year. And if he stays longer, the cost per year would even improve. But I'm just coming from Sierra Leone, and conditions that are there, if this money is channeled into trying to help the suffering of people in Sierra Leone, giving them microfinance and other things, personally I believe it would have been a resource better used than what we are going through, especially when you look at the fact that after all the atrocities, Chastela went through the democratic process and was voted for by 70% of the electorate. He became head of state, and his exit was actually negotiated by ECOWAS, and they promised him that he'll be exiled in Nigeria. Then all of a sudden, issues turn around. The political element becomes so light that the significance of justice steps away. And the fact is that you ask if there can be reconciliation under these situations where in Liberia now the youth are on the street demonstrating, calling for his return. That doesn't mean that what things he has done in the past or have done in the past are just or good. But then we must look at things from two perspectives. I was reading the independent newspaper from UK today, and Robert Fisk was writing about the children of Fallujah, the hospital of horrors. I'm talking about the second Iraq war, the ravage, the chaos, the destruction, the inhuman nature of the war that Bush visited outside the United Nations. And if we are talking about impunity, are we not making double standard, one standard for Western powers and one Western leaders and another standard from African leaders? These are the major ramifications of this judgment.
Let me get a clear-cut answer from you on this one, because I think you said you had indicated earlier that you think that a guilty verdict was going to hand it down to him anyway. It has come. You say that it is largely circumstantial. Of course, in law, and this is public international law, circumstantial does not entirely absolve you of guilt, except that the standards that has been demanded is that it must fit mathematical conclusions for that circumstantial finality to be found. Do you believe that there was enough finality about the evidence you call circumstantial to hand Charles Taylor with this verdict? Or are you suggesting that you think that since you say a different set of rules for Africa, a different set of rules for the West, that Charles Taylor probably should have walked away free?
Well, what I'm saying is that Charles Taylor is guilty of crimes. Every African or every West African is evident that Charles Taylor has been the main actor behind the Liberian Civil War, one of the main actors, let me put it that way, behind the Liberian Civil War and the Sierra Leonean Civil War. So from that perspective, from a West African perspective or traditional perspective, he's guilty. The crimes, for example, he initiated the whole process whereby people are amputated, people have been killed, and that sort of thing, all kinds of atrocities. So from our West African concept of justice, he is guilty. But then the question being I want to ask is that there were permissive conditions under which these civil wars and conflicts occurred. And as I was saying earlier on, in order to come to terms of what went on in the early 1990s and have principal policies as to put a stop to them, we must examine the causes or the antecedents of these civil wars from a more nuanced perspective, from a more comprehensive perspective. In Sierra Leone now, it appears that Charles Taylor has been responsible for all their wars. But then the British cannot be absolved of grief. The sort of colonial policies they created, that created a conducive ground for chiefs to to humiliate their people, to maltreat their people, to misrule their people. Sheikh Stevens, so what, government and all of them. So if we to be that Chastela has been guilty, impunity is punished, and for that matter, it will be like sweeping our debt under the list, not being like the ostrich. And as I'm pointing out, the conditions of the antecedents before the civil war in Liberia and Sierra Leone are being recreated by the elite. In Sierra Leone today, corruption is as high as ever.
Can I get you to say whether the verdict was just or not just? Briefly,
no,
our time is up.
The point is that it's not for me to say the verdict is just or not just. That's the analysis I have made, that from an African perspective, he's guilty as charged, given the role he played. But then according to Western standards, the kind of evidence that should be provided, and then the black and white between the evidence and the guilt pronouncement has not been there.
There were 115 witnesses. You don't think they convinced the court enough?
For example, let's talk about Diamond. The only evidence that has been provided is about Naomi Campbell, the model.
Yes.
That she was given a rough diamond by somebody when he visited Nelson Mandela in South Africa. And later on, he got to know that that person is Charles Taylor.
Interesting. We have to leave it there. We have to go. Our time really is up, Doc. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you too for joining us. But as we all know, Charles Taylor pleaded penury, and for that matter said that he could not afford it, leaving the court to foot a bill of $100,000 a month for lawyers, for rent, and for staff. That's quite some money if you factor everything in it. But we have some messages here. I think that we have to take a message or two if we can deal with it, if it's possible. But okay. Barney Michael says the law must take its own course. I think it summarizes everything.